Guys, so I just thought that I should read Immanuel Kant's books today, but I don't understand any of it. Can someone just please help me? Kant? That's one of my favorite philosophers. What do you need help with? I got you. Like everything? You know what? It's fine. I don't even see the point of this. I give up. No. Don't give up. I can definitely help you. Just ask me some questions along the way if you're stuck. Fine. Just please make it easy to understand. Please. Hi guys, welcome back to the Anna-losophy podcast. Today we're talking about a philosopher who is honestly one of my absolute favorites, Immanuel Kant. Just something to note is that Kant has a reputation for being incredibly difficult to read. Even among philosophers, he's famous for writing some of the densest and most confusing texts ever produced. In fact, there are entire university courses dedicated just to helping people understand what Kant is actually saying. But once you push through all of that, you do realize that there are a lot of interesting things about Kant. And Kant is asking some of the most important questions in all of philosophy. The reason I love Kant so much is because he forces you to think consistently. A lot of people have moral beliefs until those beliefs becomes quite inconvenient to act upon in certain situations. But Kant definitely doesn't let you do that. He takes your principles, pushes them even to their logical extreme, and asks whether you're willing to stand by them no matter what. Last episode, we talked about the trolley problem and the conflict between utilitarianism and duty-based ethics. While today, we're stepping into the mind of the philosopher who became the most famous defender of duty-based ethics ever. So to organize today's episode, Annabelle, you get to decide. What do you want me to answer? I guess the three main ones I have are: number one, can morality depend on consequences? Number two, is it ever okay to lie? And number three, are people valuable because of what they can do or because they're simply human? Okay, then let's start with the first question. Can morality depend on consequences? For most people, the answer is generally yes. If an action leads to good outcomes, we tend to call it good. If it leads to bad outcomes, we call it bad. And that seems like common sense. If someone donates money to a charity that helps hundreds of people, most of us would say that was a good action. But if there was someone who makes a decision that harms a lot of innocent people, most of us would say that was a harmful and bad action. We naturally judge things by their results, in other words, because results affect real people. And in fact, this way of thinking forms the very premise of one of the most famous ethical theories ever developed, and that is utilitarianism, and that is the concept we're going to explore in future episodes. Utilitarian philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill argued that the morally correct action is the one that produces the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, if one choice helps more people than another choice, then it's usually the better one. And at first, it sounds very reasonable. In many situations, it feels quite obvious, like if you can save 5 lives instead of 1, why wouldn't you? If you can reduce suffering for a larger number of people, why wouldn't you? And this is why utilitarianism remains so influential today. But Kant thought that there was a very serious problem with this approach. He pointed out that a lot of consequences are often beyond our control. Like, you can make a decision with the best intentions imaginable, and it just fails because of circumstances that you couldn't predict. At the same time, it's possible that someone can act so selfishly and accidentally create a positive outcome. So if morality really does depend entirely on results, then it becomes difficult to judge the morality of the person making the decision. Instead, we're just judging luck. Imagine 2 students preparing for an exam. One studies diligently for a matter of weeks, takes a lot of notes, and genuinely works hard. The other barely studies at all and simply gets lucky, and I guess the first student maybe woke up on the wrong side of the bed that morning. If the second student happens to earn a higher score, would we really say the second student showed greater responsibility? Most people would probably say no if they know the context of it all. We recognize that effort and intention matter, not just outcomes. Kant believed that morality works in a similar way. For him, what matters most is not what happens after you act. It matters why you acted in the very first place. He believed the highest form of morality comes from a sense of duty. And in other words, a person should do the right thing because it's right. They shouldn't do it because they expect rewards or fear punishment. And this idea becomes extremely important when we think about the trolley problem, which we discussed in the last episode. Remember the basic scenario. A runaway trolley is heading towards 5 people and it's speeding towards them tied to a track. You can pull a lever and redirect it onto another track where only one person will be run over and tragically pass away. A utilitarian typically says that yes, you should pull the lever. 5 lives saved is better than 1 life saved. But Kant isn't satisfied with that answer because he worries that focusing entirely on outcomes can possibly justify actions that violate moral principles. And once morality becomes a numbers game, a ton of questions emerge, like where do you draw the line? Can you sacrifice one innocent person to save 5? But what if it's 1 against 100? What about 1 against 1,000? At what point do individuals stop being people and start becoming actual statistics? This is one of the reasons Kant developed his most famous idea, the categorical imperative. The name sounds a little bit complicated, but the basic idea is actually pretty simple. Before you do something, ask yourself this. Is the rule you're following something that can become a universal law, and the universe would still be fine? In other words, what would happen if everyone acted this way? Like take lying, for example. Imagine everybody lied whether it benefited them. Eventually, trust would disappear. Promises would also become meaningless. Contracts would become meaningless. Communication itself would begin to break down from the core because nobody could rely on what anyone else said. According to Kant, this shows that lying cannot really be a universal moral rule. But what I find fascinating about Kant is how seriously he takes consistency. He refuses to let people make exceptions simply because the situation is pretty difficult to figure out. Whether you agree with him or not, there is something quite impressive about that level of commitment. And this leads directly into our second question. Is it ever acceptable to lie? And this is probably where Kant becomes very controversial. Imagine this situation. Let's say that I'm hiding my friend inside my house. A murderer comes to my door with a knife and asks whether my friend is inside. And most people immediately know what they do. They don't know the murderer, they know the friend. They would lie. They would protect their friend. I think almost everyone would probably lie, and that's just probably their gut feeling. I would probably lie. But Kant says you shouldn't. According to Kant, lying is always morally wrong. Now, when people first hear this, they usually think he's completely unreasonable. After all, if telling the truth gets someone killed, how could that possibly be a moral choice? But Kant's reasoning is actually a lot more sophisticated than it first appears. He argues that morality cannot depend on circumstances, it's just always universally true. The moment we start making exceptions whether situations become difficult, moral rules stop being moral rules. They become rules that we follow only when convenient, which means that's just not a rule at all. Basically, Kant is asking a very uncomfortable question. Do we actually believe in our principles, or are we going to abandon those principles whenever they're tested? And that is why he refuses to create exceptions for lying. If honesty is a moral duty, then it remains a duty even when telling the truth is hard. Now, I have to admit that this is one of the places where I struggle with Kant the most. It's one thing to defend honesty in ordinary situations. It's another thing entirely to insist on honesty when innocent lives are at stake. And many philosophers have criticized him for exactly this reason. But even for people who disagree with the conclusion, the challenge he raises is quite important. Imagine a world where everyone lies whenever they think they have a good reason. Suddenly, every person becomes the judge of when honesty matters and when it doesn't. One person lies to protect a friend, another lies to gain money, another lies because they think that their political goals justify it, and eventually the exceptions start multiplying. Kant is worrying here that if we start bending principles, if we start bending rules, we may not know where to stop. Actually, we might not even stop at all. And this debate becomes even more relevant today. Think about misinformation online. Think about fake news, manipulated images, propaganda, statistics that aren't true. A lot of people justify spreading misinformation because they believe it serves a greater purpose. But Kant, if he were still here, would argue that probably the moment truth is optional for us, there's no trust between us anymore. Again, you don't have to agree with him completely. But either way, what he's saying is that he forces us to take honesty more seriously than we otherwise might. Now let's move to the third question, which is probably my favorite part of Kant's philosophy. Are people valuable because of what they do or because they're human? And this question is really just so important because it sits at the heart of everything Kant ever believed. According to Kant, every human being possesses inherent dignity. Not because they're, genuinely intelligent, but they possess dignity simply because they're rational human beings capable of making choices. So talent doesn't matter, wealth doesn't matter, the success of yourself doesn't matter, whether you're attractive or not doesn't matter, whether you're rich and powerful, all of it doesn't matter. They possess dignity, again, simply because they're rational human beings capable of making choices. And this idea is pretty widespread today, but it was incredibly influential back then as well. Kant believed that people should never be treated merely as means to an end. In simpler terms, you should never treat another person as a tool for achieving your goals. A tool exists to be used. Like, a famous example that's used is that you have a hammer to hammer nails. A calculator exists to solve calculations, but human beings are different. They have their own goals, dreams, ambitions, choices. We're not used for the same thing. So when we reduce someone to a tool, we fail to respect them. We fail to respect their humanity. And this brings us back to the trolley problem again, especially the version involving the large man standing on the bridge. In that scenario, pushing him onto the tracks would save 5 people but kill him. Now, many utilitarians argue that this is pretty acceptable because the outcome is better overall. Numerically, 1 person dies, which is unfortunate, but that means 5 people are saved. Kant strongly disagrees. Why? Because you're using the man as a means to achieve an end. His death becomes a tool for saving others. Now, according to Kant, this violates the dignity that every human being possesses. So imagine a society where people are valued only for what they contribute. What happens to individuals who are elderly? What happens to people with disabilities? What happens to people who are underemployed or struggling? If human value depends entirely on this metric of usefulness, then some people inevitably become worth less than others. But Kant rejects this idea completely. He argues that no matter who you are, no matter where you're from, every person possesses value regardless of their productivity or achievements. This is really why his philosophy is still so influential. A lot of modern ideas about human rights, equality, and dignity, they're all connected to this one belief. And you can see Kant's influence whenever people argue that every person deserves respect, simply because they're human. You can see it in a lot of discussions about civil rights, social justice, human rights. And you can even see it in debates about AI and technology, where people ask whether efficiency should ever come at the expense of human dignity. What I really admire about Kant is that he never lets people hide behind numbers, but really he constantly forces us to remember that as individuals, we do matter. A society can become obsessed with efficiency, productivity, and outcomes, but Kant keeps asking whether we're respecting the people affected by those outcomes. And before we finish, I want to talk briefly about Kant's legacy because it's very difficult to overstate how influential he became. Many historians divide philosophy into 2 periods, and that's literally before Kant and after Kant. And that's not because everyone agreed with him. In fact, a lot of philosophers spent their entire careers criticizing him. But even those critics had to engage with his ideas. And despite transforming philosophy, Kant lived a very quiet life. He spent most of his life in cities and became famous for following such a predictable daily routine that people supposedly used his afternoon walks to tell time. So imagine being so consistent that your neighbors literally use you as a clock. That might be the most Kantian thing imaginable. So that is why he challenged people to think seriously about principles and truth. He asked questions that remain relevant centuries later. Can morality depend on consequences? Is it ever acceptable to lie? Are people valuable because of what they can do or because they're human? And those questions don't have easy answers. In fact, the longer you think about them, the harder they become. But that's exactly why Kant is so cool. So thank you for joining me for today's episode. We covered a lot of ground, and yeah, it's still not the entire story of Kant, so we're probably going to continue more later. And whether you agree with Kant or completely disagree with him, I think there is something valuable about debating about these questions. And that's one reason he's one of my absolute favorite philosophers. Instead of giving you complete answers, there aren't really. He forces you to explore your own beliefs and ask whether you truly stand by them no matter what. I'll catch you guys in your next episode. Bye!